The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to control that animal, or I'll be forced to have you both removed from this aircraft." Her tone carried the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance, the kind of voice that had silenced countless passengers over the years with its cold efficiency. The elderly man in seat 12A looked up with tired eyes, his weathered hands gently stroking the German shepherd lying quietly at his feet. The dog wasn't barking, wasn't growling, wasn't causing any visible disturbance. Rex was simply breathing heavily, occasionally whimpering softly as his owner whispered calming words that seemed to carry the weight of shared memories and unspoken understanding. "He's not bothering anyone," the old man said quietly, his voice barely audible above the drone of the engines. "He's a service animal. He has every right to be here." But the flight attendant's expression hardened, her clipboard clutched like a weapon against her chest. Behind her, a woman in business attire nodded approvingly, having been the one to complain about the disruptive dog that was supposedly making her uncomfortable. Other passengers watched with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, uncertain whether they were witnessing a reasonable enforcement of airline policy or something far more troubling. "I don't care what kind of papers you think you have," the attendant continued, her voice rising just enough to draw attention from surrounding rows. "That animal is clearly distressed and is disturbing other passengers. I'm calling security right now to have you both removed." She reached for her radio with decisive movement, finger already pressing the call button. "Ground crew, this is Delta Flight 1247. I need security to Gate 23 immediately. We have a passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions regarding an uncontrolled animal." The old man's shoulders sagged slightly, not with defeat, but with the familiar exhaustion of being misunderstood, of having to fight battles he never should have had to fight. He continued stroking Rex's head, murmuring words of comfort that seemed as much for himself as for his four-legged companion. Neither of them knew that in less than 2 minutes, everything would change in a way that would leave the entire cabin speechless. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this incredible true story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories about courage and recognition deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey. Robert Mills had never wanted to be the center of attention. At 72 years old, he'd learned to navigate the world quietly, keeping his head down and his service dog close. The flight from Dallas to Seattle was supposed to be routine, just another step in his journey to visit his daughter for her birthday. He'd booked the tickets months in advance, carefully following all the proper procedures for traveling with Rex, ensuring every document was in order, every regulation met. Rex wasn't just any service dog. The 5-year-old German Shepherd had been specifically trained to detect the early signs of Robert's PTSD episodes, to provide deep pressure therapy during panic attacks, and to create physical barriers between his handler and crowds when anxiety became overwhelming. After 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless sleepless nights haunted by memories of roadside bombs and fallen comrades, Rex had become more than a companion. He was Robert's lifeline to a world that often felt too loud, too chaotic, too unpredictable. The morning had started well enough. Robert had arrived at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport 3 hours early, giving himself plenty of time to navigate security with Rex, to find their gate, and to settle into the routine that kept his anxiety manageable. He'd presented Rex's service animal documentation to the gate agent without being asked, explained the dog's function clearly and patiently, and received the standard nodding approval that suggested everything was in order. But airlines were complex ecosystems, and not every employee received the same training or possessed the same understanding of federal disability laws. What one agent approved, another might question. What one crew member accepted, another might challenge. Robert had learned this lesson the hard way over the past few years, accumulating a collection of awkward encounters and uncomfortable conversations that had gradually worn down his confidence in traveling at all. The boarding process had gone smoothly. Rex had walked calmly beside Robert down the jet bridge, had settled immediately into the designated floor space at seat 12A, and had remained perfectly still as other passengers filed past. A few people had smiled at the sight of the well-behaved dog. One child had asked her mother if she could pet him, leading to a gentle explanation about working animals and the importance of not disturbing them while they were on duty. For the first hour of the flight, everything had been peaceful. Rex had dozed quietly while Robert read a paperback novel, occasionally glancing down to check on his companion. The dog's presence was so unobtrusive that most passengers had forgotten he was there. The cabin crew had served drinks and snacks without incident, navigating around Rex's position with professional ease. But then something had changed. Robert couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started, but Rex had begun showing subtle signs of alerting behavior. The dog's ears had become more attentive, his breathing slightly more pronounced, his body position shifting from relaxed to ready. These weren't signs of distress or misbehavior. They were signs that Rex was doing exactly what he'd been trained to do, monitoring his handler's physiological responses and preparing to provide intervention if necessary. Robert recognized the signals immediately. He'd been feeling the familiar tightness in his chest, the slight acceleration of his heartbeat that often preceded a full anxiety episode. The crowded cabin, the recycled air, the subtle turbulence. All of it was combining to trigger responses that his mind and body had learned during months of combat in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. He'd begun the breathing exercises his therapist had taught him, quietly working through the techniques that had helped him manage his PTSD for the past decade. Rex, sensing his handler's needs, had shifted position slightly to provide the deep pressure contact that helped ground Robert during these moments. The dog's breathing had become more pronounced as he worked to regulate his own responses in service of his handler's needs. To anyone who understood service animals, Rex's behavior was textbook perfect. He was alerting to his handler's condition, providing therapeutic intervention, and maintaining complete control over his own responses. He wasn't barking, wasn't moving from his designated position, wasn't interacting with other passengers or crew members. He was simply doing his job with the quiet professionalism that had made him one of the most successful graduates of his training program. But to someone without that understanding, to someone who saw only a dog breathing heavily in an airplane cabin, Rex's behavior might have seemed concerning. It was this misunderstanding that had led to the complaint from the business traveler 3 rows back, who had noticed the dog's increased alertness and had decided it represented a potential problem rather than a solution in progress. When the flight attendant had approached, Robert had tried to explain. He'd offered to show Rex's documentation again, to describe the dog's training and function, to demonstrate that everything happening was exactly what was supposed to happen when a service animal was properly performing his duties. But the attendant, whose name tag read Jennifer, had already made up her mind about what she was seeing. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, she'd said with the confidence of someone who believed experience always trumped expertise. "I know the difference between a well-behaved animal and one that's having problems. That dog is clearly stressed, and stressed animals can become unpredictable. I have a responsibility to ensure the safety of all passengers." Robert had tried once more to explain, his voice patient despite the growing anxiety that Rex was helping him manage. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but Rex is performing exactly as he's been trained. He's not stressed, he's working. He's monitoring my condition and providing therapeutic support. This is what service animals do." But Jennifer's expression had hardened with the kind of defensive certainty that comes from being challenged by someone she perceived as beneath her authority. She'd radioed for security with decisive finality, making it clear that she considered the conversation over and the outcome inevitable. Now, as they waited for security to arrive, Robert felt the familiar weight of injustice settling over him like a heavy blanket. It wasn't the first time his service animal had been misunderstood. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be served. But it never got easier. If anything, each incident seemed to chip away a little more at his faith in the kindness of strangers and the fairness of systems designed to protect people like him. Rex sensed his handler's increasing distress and responded accordingly. The dog's position shifted slightly, creating more contact pressure against Robert's leg. His breathing became even more focused and deliberate, working to help regulate the physiological responses that were threatening to overwhelm his handler. To the trained eye, it was a masterclass in service animal behavior. To Jennifer, it was confirmation that the animal was becoming more agitated and needed to be removed immediately. "See," she said to the passenger who had complained, her voice carrying across several rows. "The dog is getting worse. I made the right call." Other passengers were beginning to take sides. Some nodded in agreement with Jennifer's assessment, trusting in her authority and experience. Others looked uncomfortable with the situation, sensing that something wasn't quite right but uncertain how to intervene. A few pulled out their phones, either to document what they were witnessing or to research service animal regulations in real time. Robert closed his eyes and focused on his breathing, drawing strength from Rex's steady presence beside him. He'd faced down insurgents in Afghanistan. He'd survived roadside bombs and mortar attacks, and the kind of combat that most people only saw in movies. But somehow, sitting in an airplane cabin while a flight attendant threatened to have him removed for traveling with his legally protected service animal, he felt more vulnerable than he had in any war zone. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd served his country for over 20 years, had earned medals for valor and sacrifice, had bled and suffered and lost friends in service of ideals like freedom and dignity and the rights of citizens to be treated fairly under the law. And now he was being threatened with removal from a commercial aircraft because someone had decided that his disability and the accommodation he needed to manage it were inconvenient for other passengers. But what Robert didn't know, what Jennifer didn't know, what none of the passengers in that cabin knew, was that the pilot who was flying their plane had been listening to the crew communications. Captain Michael Stevens had heard Jennifer's radio calls, had monitored the situation developing in his cabin, and was beginning to piece together a story that went far beyond a simple dispute about airline policy. Because Captain Stevens had served in Afghanistan too. He'd flown combat missions in the same regions where Robert Mills had served on the ground. And he'd heard stories about a legendary explosives detection team that had saved countless lives during some of the most dangerous operations of the entire war. Stories about a Marine gunnery sergeant and his German Shepherd partner who had become the stuff of legend among forward operating bases throughout Helmand Province. Stories about a dog named Rex who had detected an improvised explosive device that would have killed an entire platoon of soldiers, including Captain Stevens' younger brother Tommy, who had been serving his first deployment as a 19-year-old private in the Army's 82nd Airborne Division. As the pieces clicked into place in Captain Stevens' mind, as he realized who was sitting in seat 12A and what was happening to him, the pilot reached for his microphone with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. Because sometimes, justice required someone in authority to speak up. Sometimes, recognition came from unexpected places. And sometimes, the most important announcements weren't about turbulence or arrival times, but about honor and sacrifice and the debt of gratitude that could never be fully repaid. The intercom crackled to life with the distinctive sound that always commanded attention throughout the cabin. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Passengers looked up from their devices and magazines. Even Jennifer paused in her radio communications, conditioned by years of experience to listen when the captain spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Stevens speaking from the flight deck." His voice carried the calm authority that passengers expected from their pilot. But there was something else there too. An emotional undercurrent that suggested this wasn't going to be a routine announcement about weather or flight time. "I need to address a situation that's developing in our cabin today, and I need you all to understand something important about one of our passengers." He paused, gathering his thoughts and his composure before continuing. "We have the honor of flying today with Gunnery Sergeant Robert Mills, United States Marine Corps, and his service dog Rex." Robert looked up in surprise, his anxiety momentarily forgotten as he heard his name and rank announced over the aircraft's public address system. Around him, other passengers began turning to locate the source of the captain's attention. Jennifer's hand froze on her radio, uncertainty replacing the confident authority she displayed moments before. Captain Stevens' voice continued, growing stronger and more emotional with each word. Gunnery Sergeant Mills served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, where he and Rex worked as an explosives detection team. They specialized in finding improvised explosive devices before those devices could kill American soldiers and Afghan civilians. The cabin had fallen into complete silence now. Even the background conversations and electronic device sounds had ceased as every person on board focused on the captain's words. Rex remained calm beside Robert, sensing that something significant was happening, but maintaining his professional demeanor throughout. Rex isn't just a service dog, folks. Rex is a war hero. In 2019, during Operation Desert Hawk, Rex detected an IED that had been planted along a patrol route in Helmand Province. That device was designed to kill an entire platoon of soldiers who were scheduled to walk that path less than an hour later. Captain Stevens' voice broke slightly as he continued. One of those soldiers was my younger brother, Private Tommy Stevens. Rex saved Tommy's life that day. He saved the lives of 23 other American soldiers. And he did it while working alongside a Marine who had already given more than 20 years of his life to protecting the freedoms that allow us to travel safely today. The emotional impact of the captain's words began rippling through the cabin like a physical force. Passengers who had been indifferent to the situation moments before were now staring at Robert and Rex with expressions of awe and gratitude. The woman who had complained about the dog's presence was covering her mouth with her hand, her face flushed with embarrassment and shame. But Captain Stevens wasn't finished. His voice grew stronger, more commanding, carrying the full weight of his authority as both pilot and grateful brother. Gunnery Sergeant Mills suffers from PTSD as a result of his service to our country. Rex is his legally protected service animal, trained specifically to help manage the invisible wounds that too many of our veterans carry. Any suggestion that this war hero and his canine partner should be removed from this aircraft is not only legally wrong, it's morally indefensible. Jennifer's face had gone pale, her radio forgotten in her hand as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She looked around the cabin at the faces staring at her, at the passenger who had complained now shaking her head in apparent regret, at the elderly veteran sitting quietly with his service dog while the captain of the aircraft defended his right to travel with dignity. I want everyone on this plane to understand something. Captain Stevens continued, his voice now carrying the full emotional weight of personal gratitude and professional authority. Gunnery Sergeant Mills and Rex didn't just serve our country. They saved specific, individual lives. They prevented specific, individual tragedies. They made it possible for sons and brothers and fathers to come home to their families. He paused again, allowing the impact of his words to settle throughout the cabin before delivering his final statement. Rex detected over 40 explosive devices during his service. 40 devices that would have killed or maimed hundreds of American soldiers and Afghan civilians. This dog has saved more lives than most people ever get the chance to touch. He is not a disturbance. He is not a problem. He is a hero, and he will be treated as such for the duration of this flight. The silence that followed Captain Stevens' announcement lasted only a moment before the cabin erupted in spontaneous, thunderous applause. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that sometimes greeted routine announcements. This was raw, emotional appreciation from people who suddenly understood they were in the presence of something extraordinary. Passengers throughout the aircraft were standing, turning towards seat 12A, clapping with genuine enthusiasm and gratitude. Some were crying openly, moved by the story and ashamed of their earlier indifference. Others were taking photos and videos, wanting to document and share this moment of recognition for a veteran who had served with such distinction. Robert sat overwhelmed by the attention, his hand still resting on Rex's head as the dog remained perfectly calm despite the commotion around them. Tears rolled down the old Marine's cheeks as he experienced something he hadn't felt in years, being seen not as a burden or a problem, but as someone whose service and sacrifice mattered to complete strangers. Jennifer stood frozen in the aisle, her radio hanging limply in her hand, her face burning with the shame of having threatened to remove a war hero from the aircraft. The passenger who had complained about Rex was crying, repeatedly whispering, "I'm so sorry," toward Robert's seat. Flight attendants from other sections of the cabin were making their way forward, wanting to apologize and show respect for the veteran and his service dog. But perhaps most importantly, Rex continued doing his job throughout the entire incident. Despite the noise, the attention, and the emotional intensity of the moment, the German Shepherd remained focused on his handler's needs. He could sense Robert's overwhelming emotions and was providing the steady, calming presence that had been trained into him through months of specialized preparation. As the applause gradually subsided, Captain Stevens' voice returned to the intercom one final time. "Gunnery Sergeant Mills, from the flight deck and from my family personally, thank you for your service. Thank you for the sacrifices you've made. And thank you for allowing us the honor of sharing this flight with you and Rex. He paused before adding, for everyone else on board, I hope you'll take a moment during the remainder of our flight to reflect on the fact that the freedoms we enjoy, including the freedom to travel safely, are protected by people like Gunnery Sergeant Mills and the sacrifices they make on our behalf. We owe them our gratitude, our respect, and our support. As the captain's announcement ended and normal cabin activities slowly resumed, the atmosphere on Flight 1247 had been permanently transformed. Passengers were approaching Robert's seat to shake his hand, to pet Rex with permission, to share their own stories of military family members and their gratitude for his service. Flight attendants were bringing him complimentary drinks and snacks, apologizing profusely for the earlier incident. Jennifer eventually approached as well, her earlier authority replaced by genuine humility and remorse. Gunnery Sergeant Mills, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I didn't understand, and I should have listened better. I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you and Rex. Robert looked up at her with tired but kind eyes, the same eyes that had seen too much war and carried too much pain, but had somehow retained their capacity for forgiveness. It's okay, he said simply. You were doing your job as you understood it. Now you understand it better. Rex looked up at Jennifer too, his tail wagging slightly in what seemed like acceptance of her apology. Dogs, even more hero dogs, were generally more forgiving than humans when it came to misunderstandings and mistakes. For the remainder of the flight to Seattle, Robert and Rex became the unofficial celebrities of the cabin. Passengers shared stories, asked questions, and expressed gratitude in ways that ranged from simple thank you notes to offers of assistance and friendship. Children drew pictures of Rex to give to Robert. Business travelers shared contact information, wanting to stay in touch with the veteran who had served their country with such distinction. But perhaps most meaningfully, the incident had created a ripple effect of awareness and understanding that extended far beyond the confines of Flight 1247. Passengers began posting about their experience on social media, sharing Captain Stevens' story, and educating their networks about service animals and veteran issues. The woman who had initially complained about Rex became one of the most vocal advocates for Robert and his service dog, using her business platform to promote veteran support organizations. Jennifer underwent additional training about service animals and disability accommodations, eventually becoming one of the airline's most knowledgeable crew members on these issues. She never forgot the lesson she learned that day about the importance of listening, understanding, and recognizing that every passenger had a story worth respecting. As Flight 1247 touched down in Seattle, Robert Mills reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He'd boarded the plane expecting another routine trip, another series of small battles to fight for his right to travel with Rex, another collection of uncomfortable interactions with people who didn't understand his needs or his service. Instead, he'd experienced something remarkable: recognition, gratitude, and respect from a community of strangers who had been transformed by learning his story. He'd been reminded that heroism comes in many forms, including the courage of a pilot who spoke up when speaking up mattered, and the willingness of passengers to change their perspectives when presented with new information. Most importantly, he'd been reminded that his service mattered, that the sacrifices he and Rex had made were valued and appreciated, and that the invisible wounds he carried were understood by more people than he'd realized. The flight that had begun with threats of removal had ended with standing ovations and genuine connections that would last far beyond the duration of the journey. As Robert and Rex made their way off the plane, Captain Stevens was waiting at the gate. Tommy Stevens, the little brother whose life had been saved by Rex's nose and Robert's courage, was there too. Now a successful engineer with a family of his own, still grateful for the second chance he'd been given by a Marine and his dog in a distant desert years earlier. The reunion between the three of them, soldier, pilot, and war dog, was captured by passengers still documenting the extraordinary story they'd witnessed. But the real impact of that day couldn't be captured in photos or videos. It lived in the changed perspectives of everyone who had been aboard Flight 1247, in the increased awareness of service animal rights and veteran issues, and in the reminder that heroism often travels quietly among us, waiting to be recognized by those with the wisdom to see it. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign battlefields, but in airplane cabins and airport terminals, in the everyday interactions between people who have served and people who benefit from that service. Sometimes recognition comes from unexpected sources, from pilots who remember stories told by brothers, from passengers who learn to see beyond their initial assumptions, from systems that work the way they're supposed to when good people stand up for what's right. Robert Mills never asked to be called a hero. He never sought public recognition or special treatment. He simply wanted to travel with his service dog, to visit his daughter, to live his life with the dignity and respect that every veteran deserves. But sometimes heroism is recognized not because we demand it, but because we encounter people who understand its value and are willing to speak up when it matters most. Rex continued his service that day and every day afterward, providing the support and companionship that allowed his handler to navigate a world that often felt too complicated and overwhelming. But he also served as a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, that service extends beyond human experience, and that the bonds forged in combat can create connections that transcend species and time. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone stood up for what was right, even when it would have been easier to stay silent? Maybe it was defending someone who was being treated unfairly, or speaking truth to power when others were afraid to act. Tell us in the comments about those moments of courage that restored your faith in humanity. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We'll see you in the next one.